Our guest this evening is Fred Fleitz. He was previously the Deputy Assistant to President Donald Trump and the Chief of Staff to National Security Advisor John Bolton. He also worked in the State Department under the Bush-Cheney administration, and he is now the Vice President of the America First Policy Institute, where he is an architect of and helps to define a lot of the America First policies, especially foreign policy, that Donald Trump, and if he wins his administration, intend to pursue. Mr. Fleitz, thank you so much for coming on our show. It's great to see you. So I wanted to, yeah, absolutely. So I want to just give you the opportunity. I know when we promoted the show, we had, I think I referred to you as, or we referred to you as John Bolton's protege, and you objected to that. You said you have a lot of differences with John Bolton. So at your request, we changed that to make it clear that that was in the past. So if you could, I actually had intended on asking you this anyway, because my perception of you had always been that you were kind of an ally or a ideological fellow traveler of John Bolton's. That's how I think you ended up in the Trump administration, was when he became hired by Trump. You became his chief of staff. And there are obviously a lot of differences now between John Bolton and President Trump. And my understanding is there's a lot of differences between John Bolton and yourself. So can you talk about why it is that you think John Bolton has become such a harsh critic of Donald Trump, and what differences you have with him that you didn't previously have with him in the past?
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I was in government for about 25 years. Most of that time, I was in the intelligence community. And when I worked for Bolton at State, I was detailed from the CIA to the State Department. And I broke with John a long time ago over bombing Iran and bombing North Korea. I was on a Tucker Carlson show in mid-2019, just when the U.S. was about to bomb Iran. And you may remember this because all of Trump's advisors wanted Trump to bomb Iran. At the last minute, I should say all of them except for my colleague, General Keith Kellogg, at the last minute, Trump said, I'm not going to do that because I'm going to kill 100 to 200 Iranians for just shooting down an unmanned drone. Well, Tucker had me on the show because he wanted to bash me, thinking, well, you work for Bolton, you must support starting these unnecessary wars and using military force without good reason. But that is not the way I think. And we had a great discussion, but I think Carlson was surprised. And I haven't talked to John since 2020 when I denounced his book, which betrayed his confidential discussions with President Trump in the Oval Office, which I think did a lot of damage to the Office of the Presidency, the Office of the National Security Advisor. National Security Advisors have to basically maintain the trust of presidents and not betray information that they discuss with them confidentially. I don't know why John Bolton went off the rails with President Trump, but I guess looking over it, I don't think he was ever suited to work in the Trump administration. His approach of wanting to bomb Iran and bomb other countries to get things done was inconsistent with Trump's America First approach to national security, to keep us out of unnecessary wars, to use military force prudently, and to use other tools of diplomacy other than military force to resolve our differences.
I think that's one of the things that a lot of people who found Trump's 2016 campaign messaging appealing, and not just his campaign messaging, but just off the cuff when he would speak, and you could kind of get a sense of his instincts on things like foreign policy. One of the things that ended up being quite confusing is that he did end up appointing a lot of people whose entire career was not just divergent from, but quite antithetical to that kind of restraint, that kind of aversion to unnecessary wars, a kind of focus on domestic politics. For me, Mike Pompeo is one example, who ended up running the CIA and the State Department. Nikki Haley, who became ambassador to the UN, as we saw in this campaign, is another who has a lot of sharp differences with Trump. And there were many others as well. I recently heard someone saying that, it was actually RFK, that he himself posed that question to Trump. Why were there so many people in important positions in your administration who didn't share, obviously John Bolton, another, who didn't share the foreign policy vision that you outlaid? And he said that Trump told him he didn't really know how to fight the permanent power faction in Washington. He got to D.C., didn't know it well. A lot of people were pressuring him, saying you have to hire these people, these people. What is your explanation for why there ended up being so many people at such high levels of the Trump administration who clearly had never supported the foreign policy vision, the America First vision, as outlined, as defended by Trump in 2016?
What you said is exactly right. And I think Trump brought people in who were determined not to carry out his policies and to maybe carry out other policies without telling him or to talk him into other policies. Look, Donald Trump was the ultimate outsider. He had not worked in Washington. I don't think he'd even lived in Washington before he won the election. And when he came into the White House, there were a lot of people who seemed to have good intentions with great credentials, like Condoleezza Rice and Bob Gates, who referred people who would look good on paper, but Trump didn't have the background, his team didn't realize that these folks were not in line with his beliefs. And if you talk to Trump now, he'll tell you he made mistakes because he was the ultimate outsider. He was adapting. And also, I think Trump really underestimated the determination of the deep state to destroy him and to go after his policies. Trump tried to fix this at the end of his administration, but it was too late. But look, Glenn, I'm happy to say now, Trump and his team learned from those mistakes. And I know many good people who you would agree with who were lining up to work in national security positions with Mr. Trump. He will not make that mistake again.
So I want to probe on that and press a little bit on that, because for me, it's such an important point, because part of what I found appealing about Donald Trump's 2016 campaign was this very radical deviation from what had been, I think, longstanding bipartisan consensus on foreign policy. And maybe in the past, people might have thought it was right, and now it's not. But whatever, that was a radical break, and it ended up not often being reflected in administration policy, and I think in part because of that. But in addition to what you said, which I totally believe, that Trump got there and was kind of in the dark about, you have a bunch of positions you have to appoint, you rely on people who are not in accordance with your ideology, and you end up appointing a lot of people who are more sabotaging or undermining what you say you want to do and what you want to do than not. There is this other aspect to it, which I think even the most ardent Trump supporters will agree is a problem, which is that Trump has this personality flaw that if you flatter him, if you heap praise on him, he's somebody who will trust and like you and even appoint you to certain positions. And I just heard Trump, I think it was when he was talking to Elon Musk, or maybe in a campaign rally, saying, look, I'm somebody who's very simple. If you say good things about me, I will like you. Do you agree that part of the reason why Trump was able to be kind of maneuvered around so easily wasn't just because of his lack of familiarity with everybody in Washington and how it worked, but also this personality trait that he has, and what gives you confidence that he won't fall prey to that again?
No, my experience is he really was taken off guard by people like H.R. McMaster and Rex Tillerson and John Bolton and General Mattis, who just weren't carrying out his policies. He ordered something to be done, and they decided to do something else, and they all ended up being let go. I just think he assumed that since he was the president, people would carry out his policies. And let me add something that's related to what you're saying. Remember when Trump decided to talk to Kim Jong-un? The establishment hated this idea. John Bolton hated this idea because it's not the way you're supposed to do things. Presidents can't meet with bloodthirsty dictators like that. It's the wrong thing to do. But it was the right thing to do. It was certainly a lot better than bombing North Korea, and it significantly lowered tensions. It was unconventional. And in the end, when it did lower tensions, when it got North Korea to stop testing missiles, even some of the president's liberal critics agreed that this is better than what we've tried before. We should do more of this.
Yeah, you might remember in the 2008 presidential primary, this protracted war between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton that culminated in Obama's success. One of their first big differences in the debate was Obama was asked, there's a series of 5 or 6 dictators, I think Assad, at the time Chavez, maybe Kim Jong-un, or his father at the time was running North Korea, and they asked him, would you agree to meet with these leaders without conditions? And Obama said, yes, of course. I think it's crucial that we have open dialogue. That's the way we prevent war, misperception, miscommunication. And Hillary Clinton said that's incredibly naive. Of course you don't meet with these bad leaders. And so I remember very well that when Obama said it, it was something that gained a lot of applause for him on the left. And then when Trump started doing it, there tended to be a little bit of a different reaction. Let me ask you about this issue you referred to about the deep state opposing Trump, being so dedicated to his sabotage. I remember very well, I still think it's one of the most important things that has happened publicly in our politics was in between Trump's election in 2016 and his inauguration on January 20th, 2017, there was this kind of back and forth between Trump and the CIA where he was kind of mocking them over getting Iraq wrong and the intelligence wrong. And I think the reason was because the CIA was hyping this Russiagate narrative that Trump believed was designed to undermine the legitimacy of his election. And Chuck Schumer went on Rachel Maddow and she asked him about that. And Chuck Schumer said, look, you know, even just from the perspective of being a hard-nosed businessman, which Trump is, it's incredibly stupid to confront and bash the CIA because everyone in Washington knows you don't do that because they have 6 different ways from Sunday to get back at you. And for me, that was just an I mean, of course, everyone knows that, but that was an extraordinary thing to admit that a president, the elected president, cannot confront the intelligence community because they will destroy him in one way or the other. Now, it is surprising for me to hear that from you, given that you spend a lot of time as an analyst with the CIA. Although I know there are people inside the intelligence community who know even better than most people what its function is, what its flaws are. But why do you think that this permanent U.S. security state was so devoted to sabotaging Trump, either in the campaign or the administration? And what kind of tools do you think they use to do that?
Well, first of all, they're part of what I call the foreign policy establishment. And in the government, they're promoting a liberal international approach to government. And when I worked at the State Department, careers used to say that, you know, we are basically safeguarding the organization for the future. We have to outlast these people. But in the CIA and other intelligence agencies, they've forgotten that their only mission is to provide intelligence support to the president. They're not supposed to be second-guessing the president. They're not supposed to be giving speeches questioning presidential policy. They're not supposed to be attending open congressional hearings where they say presidential policy are going to fail. They've forgotten their mission. They think they're in charge. They think they have the power and the duty to adjudicate and to evaluate policy. That's not.
But do they have that power? I realize you think they shouldn't, but are they really in charge? Do they have that power to sort of override even what an elected president might want to do?
Well, they've certainly had some success in undermining presidents. And the challenge for a new Trump administration, if he wins, and I think he's going to win, is not just to put a very good head of CIA and the DNI and other agencies, but there has to be reform of these agencies. There has to be people brought in from the outside to basically assume positions throughout these bureaucracies, not to politicize them, but to make sure the careers understand that they have to keep politics out of their work, and they work for the White House. They don't work for themselves. They don't work for the New York Times or the foreign policy establishment.
Now, you use the phrase America First several times. Obviously, that's an important phrase for the Trump movement, for Trump's worldview. It definitely, I know for sure, means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. I've interviewed plenty of people who say they are supporters of the America First worldview and yet have very different views on a whole variety of things. With respect to your area that you've worked on most, which is national security and foreign policy, and as somebody who now works at a think tank with that phrase in its title, what, in your view, when it comes to, let's say, specifically the issue of involving the United States military, United States Treasury in foreign wars, what does the America First vision orient or direct someone to do with regard to that question?
First of all, you'll forgive me if I plug my book, An America First Approach to U.S. National Security, that has contributions by Morgan Ortagus and General Keith Kellogg and Chad Wolf, many other national security experts. This means a competent president, a decisive president with a strong and modernized military, who uses our military when he has to, but prudently, to keep our country out of unnecessary wars. This is not an isolationist approach, but it is an approach that demands that our allies carry their weight in defending their regions. It also means we have to defend supply chains, and we have to modernize our military to make sure it operates. We have to have an intelligence community that answers to the president. And I guess, frankly, Glenn, I think we should talk about Ukraine on this, because I think we have a great chapter on Ukraine, and I talk about how America First deals with the Ukraine war because this war has to end. This is a war that's hurting our nation.
That was I wanted to ask you to define it, and then I was going to ask you to apply it to a couple of wars. The war in Ukraine is not the only war the United States is financing, but let's start with the war in Ukraine. So The policy of the the Biden-Harris administration has been, and according to Kamala Harris, it will continue to be if she wins, and they have a lot of Republican support for this, that we should, together with NATO, finance and continue to finance the war in Ukraine until the very end, which is defined as expelling all Russian troops from every inch of Ukrainian territory, including Crimea, which the Russians regard as an existential threat and would absolutely use, I believe, nuclear weapons before they allow that to happen. And not only are we not close to that goal, we're moving further and further away from it. The Ukrainian front lines are crumbling. The Russians are controlling more and more Ukrainian territory. Is there any way to reconcile paying for, funding, and sending huge amounts of arms to the point we deplete our own stockpiles to Ukraine in this regional war with an America First vision of foreign policy?
Of course not. Our policy right now is to throw weapons at Ukraine forever, thinking somehow Ukraine's going to take back all this territory. It isn't going to take back this territory. It is going to lose this long-term war of attrition. And as this war expands, you may know this week, Ukraine attacked the suburbs of Moscow. The chances of a nuclear war are getting much higher. The only moral and practical solution to this war is to force both parties to the negotiating table and to end it. It's immoral to continue this. And what's the strategy that the Biden administration and their Democratic and Republican supporters have for pouring all this military aid on Ukraine? Basically, it's virtue signaling. Putin is evil, so we have to give weapons to Ukraine. But what is this accomplishing? It's accomplishing nothing other than it's running down our arms stockpile. It's making the situation with many nations much more dangerous and is driving Russia into the arms of China. And I think that's the biggest flaw, the biggest danger of this policy.
Which the U.S. managed not to do throughout the entire Cold War. That was one of the principal objectives, was to keep the Soviet Union and China apart. But on Ukraine, looking at things very pragmatically, given all the lives Russia has lost, all the expenditures that they've had to make, the sacrifices for this war that they've endured, to me, there's no question that in a peace negotiation, Russia will never give up Crimea, as we just discussed. Never, ever. They will not, I doubt, even consider that. And my belief is that they will insist, at the very least, on some sort of buffer where eastern Ukraine and those provinces are semi-autonomous or have some neutrality, forced neutrality. Do you agree that part of any plausible peace deal that President Trump could engineer at some point would have to be ceding some parts of what 2 years ago had been Ukrainian territory to Russian control?
What I've called for in this book, in a chapter I wrote with General Kellogg, it's not a peace plan, but it's ideas of bringing about a ceasefire, is that the war stops along the current battle lines. Negotiations begin on a final settlement. Ukraine, for now, does not cede any territory. That will be resolved in negotiations. The negotiations will take many years, and probably there will not be a final settlement until Putin leaves the political scene. The priority right now, as Trump has said, is to stop the killing, and let's use negotiations to find a peaceful solution.
What would you be prepared to offer Putin to say, let's freeze the conflict in a ceasefire, given what he perceives as the success of the Russian military in expanding further westward into Ukraine and taking over more territory? Wouldn't you have to make some very meaningful concession to him for him to say, okay, I'm going to agree to a ceasefire and we'll put the terms of the peace deal, years down the line? Why would he do that?
That could be offered is to take NATO membership off the table, maybe for 10 to 25 years, maybe some offer to loosen some sanctions on Russia. But I think also Russia should be paying for reconstruction of Ukraine, so that would have to be negotiated also. But I think if we're looking at what's our policy going to be with Russia down the road, ultimately we have to bring Russia back into Europe as a European state. Russia's not an Asian state, and this alliance between Russia and China has very dangerous implications down the road. And I think that should be communicated for Russia. That is the ultimate end state of this process, and I think it would be in Russia's interests.
If, though, you're perceiving a little bit incorrectly what the Russians are prepared to do without a lot more concessions than the ones you suggest you're willing to make, in other words, that you can't foster a ceasefire deal because the Russians won't accept it under those terms that the West and the United States are prepared to offer. Would, in your view, President Trump be willing in that event to continue to provide the financing and arms that Ukraine needs to continue to wage the war against Russia?
I have to say that everything I'm saying now, I'm not speaking on behalf of President Trump. He speaks for himself. So I have to be careful because he's worked in this very, very carefully. I think that would probably be part of the equation, that we'll continue to arm Ukraine and make sure that they are secure against this Russian offensive unless it ends. But I think if you look back, the chapter we wrote on the Ukraine conflict in our book doesn't look at how to end the war. It looks at how incompetent diplomacy and failing to recognize Putin's red lines led him to invade. I don't agree with Putin's twisted sense of history with the Russian and the Ukrainian people, but he believes these things. And the Biden administration simply ignored that. They ignored him when he said that NATO membership was a red line. And frankly, if we had a halfway competent president instead of Biden, Putin wouldn't have invaded.
Yeah, it was so ironic that Trump for 4 years was called a Russian agent, and yet Russia didn't take any Ukrainian land under Trump, yet seized Crimea under Obama, and then seized another 20% of the country seized Crimea under Obama, and then seized another 20% of the country under Biden. Just on the final question on Ukraine, though.
Invaded neighboring countries during 3 of the last 4 presidents, when Bush was weak, when Obama was weak, when Biden is weak.
Okay, but this is my question, though. That how is it possible to characterize Biden and the Democrats as being weak when increasingly, we've crossed every line that we said we wouldn't cross? We started just funding it. Then we started to provide weapon systems we said we wouldn't provide, tanks, aircraft carriers. We're now talking about lifting all the remaining restrictions on the use of American weapons by Ukraine inside Russian territory. Hasn't the strategy of the Biden-Harris administration with regard to Ukraine and Russia been one of aggression, not weakness?
It's been a record of I think it's been a record of weakness, of incompetence. All the weapons that the Ukrainians needed that could have possibly moved the Russians back arrived too late or had strings attached. The Russians are dug in right now. There's no amount of weapons we're going to provide the Ukrainians that are going to push Russia out of Ukraine. There is a way to get Russia out of Ukraine. We can send in American troops. I don't want to do that. The Biden administration doesn't want to do that. That's why I'm saying this isn't a real policy. It's virtue signaling. Biden wants to make a boogeyman out of Putin, say he's like Hamas, he's a war criminal, so I'm going to throw weapons over there, even though the weapons are making no difference. So,
and I want to be respectful of your time, and there's a couple other areas I absolutely want to get to with you. I enjoyed talking to you about this. So let me just make this the last question on Ukraine. This is what I guess has created some confusion, is on some level, your critique of the Biden administration is that their weakness was that they didn't provide more sophisticated weaponry, or they imposed too many limits on Ukraine. At the start of the war, we should have been funding Ukraine even more, arming them even more to fight the Russians even more effectively. And I still hear you saying that although you believe a peace or a ceasefire deal can be facilitated, that in the event that it can't be, you think President Trump should, or at least would, or at least should, in your view, continue to arm and fund Ukraine. In what conceivable way is arming and funding Ukraine over a regional border dispute or a territorial dispute between these two countries consistent with an America First view that says we ought to be spending our resources not to help foreign countries, but to help our own country, to secure our own country, to improve the lives of our own citizens?
Well, let's start with why I think that the Biden administration should have sent more weapons at the beginning of the war. I didn't support sending a lot of weapons to Ukraine for the war, but once the war began, there was a short period of time when the Ukrainians had a tremendous advantage and could have pushed the Russians out or back substantially. But the Biden administration didn't do that. It gave them the minimum amount of weapons with strings attached, which allowed the Russians to recover and to dig in, and now they're not going anywhere. I don't want to reward Russian aggression. I don't want Russia to take over Ukraine. At the same time, I don't want us to be depleting our arms stockpiles and funding an endless war. So you're right. It is a bit of a contradiction. We have to find a way to strike the right balance between not hurting our country and our ability to defend ourselves and our allies, and basically rewarding Russian aggression in Ukraine.
Whenever I've had members of Congress on who identify as America First or Trump surrogates or spokespeople, one of the main ways that they justify their opposition to the funding of the war in Ukraine on America First grounds is they say, look, our cities are falling apart, our populations are, deprived of all sorts of basic services. Marjorie Taylor Greene gave a speech that was actually very true about how mothers in the United States, American citizens, couldn't get baby formula, and we're sending hundreds of billions of dollars over to Ukraine to fund their war. And she was saying, why is our priority, and you hear Tucker Carlson saying that, that's kind of the America First worldview that a lot of its adherents have, that we should only help other countries once we've taken care of our own infrastructure, our own citizenry, secured our own border, et cetera. That's been the critique of Ukraine and funding the war in Ukraine. The other war, though, that we're funding is the Israeli war in Gaza. We're not only funding it, but we give them $4 billion every year. We send them more when they start wars or when they're involved in wars. We arm them. If an American worker were to come up to you and say, look, you tell me that you believe in an America First agenda where you prioritize my interests as an American citizen over the interests of other countries, how is it that you can justify then making me work and pay taxes to the U.S. government that the U.S. government uses to send over to Israel when millions of Israeli citizens have better social programs and more opportunities economically than tens of millions of Americans have? How can you square that with an America First ideology?
I think we're fairly close in Ukraine. We may have some differences, and I don't like the fact that our cities are crumbling in this crime in this country, and we're sending so many weapons to Ukraine. That's why I want to end the war. But I think America First is standing solidly behind the state of Israel, standing against terrorism, standing with Israel after the horrendous October 7th, 2023 terrorist attack. We may sort of agree in Ukraine, but I don't think we're going to agree on Israel.
No, but I know we're not. And that's what I'm trying to get you to do is not even speaking to me. As I said, Trump said in his inauguration and throughout the campaign, I'm the representative of the forgotten man, the person in the middle of the country whose towns have been deindustrialized in the name of free trade and all sorts of deals with China and other countries that have been detrimental, the prioritizing of the interests of corporations and the military-industrial complex over the average citizen. And Trump said, I'm here to change the priority where you become the priority. So imagine one of those members of the working class, white working class, multiracial working class, whatever, who comes to you and says, in my community, the streets are falling apart, there's no public transportation, crime is rampant, people are dying of fentanyl, the borders aren't closed, the fentanyl is flying freely. How can you justify making me finance Israel's military and pay for their wars that they have frequently with their neighbors when I think that money should be used instead to improve the lives of Americans, not of Israelis? How would you justify that to them on an America First basis?
Well, first of all, this theory of scarcity that there's not enough resources to go around, and that's why maybe we want to husband our resources and maybe just focus on the threat from China. I don't agree with that concept, but I don't think we have time to get into it right now. I think that one of the most important aspects of America First foreign policy is standing solidly with the state of Israel and the Jewish people, opposing anti-Zionism, opposing anti-Semitism. I think it is a principled position. I think it is in America's security interest, and I think it is a moral cause that our nation has to endorse. I endorse this without reservations, and I don't think we're going to agree on this one.
Do you think it's equally a moral cause for America to stand in opposition to anti-black racism, anti-Muslim bigotry, transphobia, xenophobia, misogyny, or is there something special and enlightened and kind of elevated about the cause of opposing anti-Semitism that ought to make it a higher priority than those other ones that I just described?
I guess I'm just appalled that there's so much press attention for all the things that you just mentioned. And my Jewish friends in New York who wear Jewish garb or look Jewish, they can't walk the streets of Manhattan because they'll be beaten to a pulp. I think there is a difference. I think I'm
Jewish
Catholic,
friends. Your Jewish friends in Manhattan cannot walk the streets without being beaten to a pulp.
Yes, there's certain areas of New York where they can't do that because. And have you seen the synagogues in New York City? They're like fortresses. This isn't right. And I'm not embarrassed to stand with the Jewish people and speak out against this. I speak out. I'm with you. I don't like those other things you mentioned, but it really bothers me that this is a form of discrimination, a form of hatred that our society and the American media doesn't seem concerned about.
I've never believed that there was an underrepresentation of concern over anti-Semitism and the well-being of Jews in the American media, but I guess that's something we're going to have a hard time reconciling, as you said. Let me ask you this last question. I actually have a lot more, but I've taken up a lot of your time, which I really appreciate. Over the weekend, Dick Cheney and Liz Cheney both endorsed Kamala Harris. They didn't just repudiate support for Donald Trump. They affirmatively said, go out and vote for Kamala Harris. And for a long time, when people like that, Bill Kristol and all the neocons from back in the day, from the Bush administration, Nicole Wallace, that whole crew were opposing Trump. They were saying, we hate the Democratic Party. We're as opposed to the Democratic Party ideologically as ever before. We're just doing this because we think Trump is a unique threat to the Republic. And I never believed that. I always thought that they saw the Democrats as becoming the better vehicle for their expansive militaristic ideology. And Liz Cheney went on ABC this morning, or over the weekend, and she was asked exactly that, like, why are you affirmatively, and your dad affirmatively supporting Kamala? Is it just because of your animosity toward Trump or your fear of what Trump will do to democracy? And she said, no. Here's what she said. I just want to play this for you.
We've been talking about economic policy. You know, you look at national security policy, and again, there are certainly areas where I disagree with Biden administration national security policy, where I've disagreed with Vice President Harris's position on issues. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to fundamental alliances, when it comes to the importance of NATO, for example, and how important it is for the United States to lead in the world, we've seen a sea change. We now have a Republican Party that is embracing isolationism, that is embracing Putin, that, you know, we've seen just in the last week, the Republican vice presidential nominee willing to appear, willing to be interviewed by Tucker Carlson, who is platforming pro-Nazis, is himself pushing pro-Nazi propaganda. That is not the party of Ronald Reagan. And I believe strongly that if you're talking about a national security set of issues and you care about America's leadership role in the world, a vote for Vice President Harris is the right vote to make.
Now, let's leave all the stuff out about Tucker Carlson, platforming a Nazi or whatever. It's a totally separate, trivial issue that I think merits no attention. On the point she's making, though, which is like, look, if you have the foreign policy ideology that my father has and that I have, the reality is that the Democratic Party is a lot closer to my foreign policy views than a Trump-led Republican Party. I feel like if I were Dick Cheney and Liz Cheney and believed what they believed, I would also probably support Kamala Harris and the Democratic Party. Do you understand or maybe even agree with her view that it makes rational sense for people who believe what the Cheneys believe about foreign policy to see the Democratic Party as a closer ally than a Trump-led Republican Party?
I think you're right there. And look, obviously Trump wasn't an isolationist, and the left is angry that Trump's Russia policies were more successful than Biden's. As you said, Putin invaded Ukraine under Biden's administration, not under Trump's. But look, the Cheneys are establishment neocons. They're George Bush country club Republicans. They're more comfortable with Bill Clinton and Barack Obama than they are with President Trump. I think that's a fact. And I think they dislike Trump because they don't like his mannerisms. They don't like the fact that he's unconventional. They don't like the fact that he doesn't do what the establishment tells him to do. And she's not going to admit that. But that's why I think you're exactly right. She's much more comfortable hanging out with Democrats.
All right. Well, I hope your optimism about Trump having learned the lessons of those past and his determination to prevent them from occurring in the future turns out to be prescient in the event that he wins. Obviously, we have some differences, but I always appreciate people coming on and being willing to discuss them in a civil and constructive way. I really appreciate your time. I'd love to have you on again, and thanks for coming on tonight.
This is great. Thank you.
All right. Have a good evening. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.